She thumps a cane and drinks champagne. She's formidable and judgmental, but we can guarantee that she's a quintessential Lady D, who recognizes great potential. What would Danbury do?
Welcome to What Would Danbury Do? Your guide to Julia Quinn's Bridgerton series from A to V. This time we're looking at An Offer from a Gentleman, as we ask the ultimate question. Is Benedict hot, or is he just tall? Don't forget, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram as @BridgertonPod. And we'd love for you to tweet us using the hashtag WWDDpod.
What, have I been clear?
You've been really clear since, yeah.
Amazing. You know what it was? I was trying to download some podcasts to put on my iPod. And I didn't even think of it. I just plugged my iPod in, and now it was what it was. But you both are now tasked with reminding me to do that when we hang up, because otherwise I'll have nothing to listen to tomorrow and I'll be very unhappy.
Okay, yeah, definitely. I will try.
I'm writing it down.
Remember.
All right. Hi, I'm Kate.
Hi, I'm Rudy.
And I'm Adele. Today we're talking about An Offer from a Gentleman by Julia Quinn, and published in 2001 by Avon Books. The dedication for Paul reads, and also for Paul, even though he doesn't see anything wrong with watching open heart surgery on TV while we're eating spaghetti. It's the third book in the series and follows the Bridgerton family's number 2, Benedict, as well as Sophia Maria Beckett, the illegitimate child of the deceased Earl of Penwood, stepdaughter to the wicked Araminta, and stepsister to the haughty Rosamond and doormat Posey. Sophie and Benedict's story kicks off in 1813 when she anonymously attends the masked Bridgerton ball and makes a big impression. And thus begins a romance that draws heavily on the story of Cinderella when she hastily departs the party. 3 years later, Sophie, a bastard and housemaid, is rescued by oblivious Benedict. She then saves him back, and finally they find themselves in the loving bosom of the Bridgerton family. Her lowly class and secretive nature, and his insistence on her becoming his mistress, prove to be difficult obstacles, as does Benedict's general Benedictness.
That's one of those things that works better in writing than it does out loud.
No, I like it.
Benedictness.
Benedictishness.
It's really interesting because this is very clearly a Cinderella story, but it doesn't draw so much from Cinderella as I think it draws from Ever After.
Ever After.
You know that movie with Drew Barrymore and I can't remember his name. He was literally in Ever After and then nothing else. Douglas something. But the whole thing with like one of the stepdaughters being slightly better than the other stepdaughter, that's very Ever After. I can't remember that ever coming through in any of the other Cinderella sort of stories or movies that I've seen.
It is occasionally a factor that one of the stepsisters isn't terrible. Like, it's occasionally a thing, but like I just kept thinking like, this is Ever After. This is like Sophia and Daniela, they're the same name. Like,
it's very much an homage. Although I have to admit that
Rosamond and Marguerite is the same name.
Oh, yeah.
Like Posey and Horse Girl. I can't remember her name.
What was her name? Oh, she was so delightful. She was only there for
Jacqueline.
The food. And I was like, I relate so hard.
Jacqueline.
That's right.
I definitely wrote myself a note when I was like on the verge of giving up. And so the one and only note that I have is it's just Ever After, but the dad lived 4 years past his wedding. Even the daughters are Marguerite and Jacqueline. If Jacqueline isn't dressing as a horse for the masquerade, I will break something. And then she didn't. She dressed as a mermaid.
Oh, yeah. It was.
She wore that metallic. Drew Barrymore wears that really amazing metallic dress. It's gold, but it's silver. Sophie, and it did make me. Yeah, I felt that most definitely, those connections too. I think Ever After came out 3 years before this book did, so...
I just looked it up. It came out in 1998. So it was definitely in the cultural consciousness when this book was being written. It's interesting because I did a lot of research for this book for reasons that escape me because I didn't do any research for any of the other books.
Did not trust us? to actually
It's
like
possible,
stick with
but I
this
just
book.
didn't trust myself. So Ever After came out in 1998, but this book has I think it's 4.08 rating on Goodreads. So I know all three of us were very convinced that this was one of the least favorite books in the series. It's certainly one of our least favorite books in the series, but I don't think that that's necessarily true across the board. Although I would be very, very interested in knowing when those ratings went up. I think that this book, as with The Duke and I, there are massive cultural shifts between when the book was written and published and now. And the things that we saw as, I don't know, romantic or even just at least acceptable 20 years ago are no longer acceptable now. And I think reading now, like just the hypervigilance of and the hyper awareness of what is acceptable behavior in relationships and what is not. Benedict just comes off so terribly, like so badly, in a way that I'm not entirely sure he would have 20 years ago. So I'm not necessarily saying it's forgivable, but I am saying that I think that reading it 20 years on, we just have to be aware of what has happened in those 20 years since, and that maybe this is one of those books that should go out of print.
I wasn't a fan the minute he ditched Penelope. I don't care that you're like little lovey-dovey spidey senses tingling. Being unrepentant about it afterwards, when he actually says he likes Penelope, I'm like, dude, not okay. But he's so intense and then occasionally quite flippant and then really aggressively dismissive.
What he is entitled. He's so entitled through this whole book and completely selfish and self-absorbed. Like completely incapable of imagining any existence except his own, and anyone wanting things that are different than the way that he wants them.
Yeah, but Kate, I think that Anthony's probably just as fucking clueless. And the difference between him and Benedict is that Anthony gets pushed into water twice. And meanwhile, we spend a book hearing about Benedict's, quote, good heart. Like, okay.
Sophie says it too as well. Like, you have such a kind heart, and you have hidden depths, and people don't really understand you. Like, it's like they're trying to prove that he's a good guy because all of his actions are proving that he is in fact not.
Yeah. See, it's one of those classic like things about the difference between showing something and telling something in a story. Like, show me that he's good, and I don't need every other character to talk about how wonderful and like good his heart is. Like, because his actions are not showing a good heart. His actions are showing someone who's using his power over some, like his social power in a way that is really coercive and like really uncomfortable to watch. It made me stressed. Like the way that he speaks to her, the way that he keeps kind of chipping away at her no, as though it's possible and okay to wear someone down, that there's any kind of romance in that, in someone eventually giving in because you just worn them down. I know that she is having sort of complicated feelings about it, and she actually isn't as unreceptive to him as she kind of is verbalizing, but it was still hard.
You don't really get why she likes him other than he's an out. You know what I mean? Like, I don't find him particularly charming, or like, yes, he can draw, but that seems just a thing to give him a bit more depth past being number two. Like, he says this thing to her when he doesn't know her name or anything. He says, I want your future. I want every little piece of you. And I'm like, I probably would have thought that was romantic at 18. Now I find that incredibly troubling. Like, he's a bit of a succubus, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite telling he's number two because he's a bit of a shit. Like, he's just... I
had a boyfriend around the same time that this book came out that told me once that when he heard no, he thought it meant try harder. And that's what I thought when I was reading this book. I'm like, that is Benedict. That's his attitude. You know, he hears no, and he's like, well, clearly I just have to redouble my efforts to get my way. And like completely being unable to see it from Sophie's point of view. Like, she's like, I'm not going to do this. This is not what I want. And he said, well, so fine, you know, I'll take care of you. I would never abandon any children that we have. And he's expecting her to just take that all on faith. Like, she literally has no power in this relationship whatsoever. She literally has no power in the world. So, and he's just asking her to just trust him.
So for me, one of the things that is kind of complicated about this book, like about An Offer from a Gentleman, is that when we were talking about the Duke and I fought really hard to defend Daphne's behaviour. When Simon will tell her what he wants and she would ignore it because she knew better. And the narrative supported that she knew better. This is the same, but it is gender flipped. And I was so angry at every single insistence from him that he's just going to try harder. He's going to figure out a way to make her say, like, to make her give in. I don't know whether it's just that it's the gender thing, but I also think that, like, at least when it was Daphne doing this to Simon, Simon had more social power than her. Or maybe not. They were more equally kind of footed because he did outrank her, sort of in a social power way. He didn't have to worry about where his money is going to come from, where he's like, what's going to be said about him if he was to leave the marriage, if he was to like abandon her altogether. But like Sophie, if he stuffs her life up and she has to walk away, she walks away with nothing. And it's really hard to read in like a modern context.
He is such a fucking hypocrite because he threatens to get her, like, for stealing, which is the same thing he goes at Araminta for at the end. It's like, you did the same thing. You would get convicted for stealing if you don't go with him. Like, Daphne wasn't that level of, like, shit. I mean, I guess it's all some questionable Bridgerton behaviour, but, like, He did the same thing. I just don't think this book flows particularly well. I feel like it's a lot of vignettes that she kept deciding what she wanted to do, and it changed from bit to bit. And it like it was the ball section, and then there was the cottage section, and then there's the Bridgerton section, and it just doesn't work very cohesively for me because I don't particularly like Sophie either.
Oh, really? I didn't mind Sophie.
I'm prepared to give her a lot of leeway.
I just feel like she was doing the best she could with what she had. You know, like her whole life was shit, but she didn't really complain about that. She didn't really rail against it. When she sort of thought about it, she was sad. She was more sad that her father hadn't kept her in mind, that this was sort of one more way that he had betrayed her as a parent shouldn't betray a child. But she just got on with things.
You know what's interesting? I completely forgot whether he actually was her father or not. Like whether there was a twist coming that she's related to him, but he's not actually her father. I could not remember what the deal was.
Do you actually buy that he loved her, as Araminta said? Because I didn't really see that either.
No, I don't think he did.
I actually quite liked that scene with Araminta. I mean, I don't like Araminta. She was a horrible person. But that sort of step-by-step as, you know, why she hated Sophie so much, I thought was well done. I thought it makes a lot of emotional sense, particularly when you think of Araminta herself being a woman in society who probably was sold to the Earl of Penwood for her dowry or, you know, for the title or whatever, and then basically failed at the one thing she was supposed to be able to do in that marriage. So, you know, she moves into a new relationship. She can't have an heir for her husband. There is an heir, or there's a living child standing there staring at her all the time. I'm not saying that she has any excuse for what she did, but I thought that the emotional resonance in that was well done.
Again, it was ever after.
I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you. It's entirely ever after.
Because it was ever after, I wanted it to happen earlier. if I'm remembering Ever After correctly, that moment between the Baroness and Danielle happens kind of a third of the way in, and you get this, and it's actually like a much more subtle moment, and she just talks about how, like, you know, oh, you look like your father, and then like, go away, I'm tired now. Yeah, your features are so mannish. Now go away, I'm tired. And it's like, it's the most beautiful moment because it makes this character that we've been seeing as like awful a little bit deeper, a little bit more complicated. Whereas like Araminta being complicated for me in like the last second is a bit... I wanted it to happen earlier.
Well, she was complicated and then she was just horrific again because she turned on Posey.
I know.
Like literally a page later. So she was complicated and then she just turned into a cardboard villain again.
Which it makes me think about Tessa Dare. Because like if you were to compare Tessa Dare and Julia Quinn, they're very similar. But Dare, like she doesn't really have villains. And from memory, that is something that she's like talked about, making a choice not to have anybody who's like a straight up villain. Everybody's got their reasons for stuff. And
but I think that's true of the rest of Julia Quinn's books, but this one was drawing so heavily on Cinderella that you couldn't really... I mean, you could. There are ways that you could have made Araminta a more fully fledged character as opposed to just the evil stepmother, but...
I honestly didn't think it needed to have that framework around it. Like, I feel like it would have been stronger without it, without drawing so closely, particularly at the beginning on the Cinderella sort of, or Ever After mapping. But yeah, I just don't like this book that much.
So thoughts and feelings on, like, because we're at this point, we're 3 books in when we suddenly have a fairy tale framework. That's kind of that's a choice.
You know, the thing for me is the sort of most emotional resonant moments in this book are either Violet, Bridgerton driven, or the moment when Colin is overheard by Penelope saying he would never marry her. That moment, and it's not like they're not really established as much. Colin is more established from guesting in other people's stories at this point than Benedict is in his own book. To be really harsh, like, you know who Colin is already, and he's barely been in 3 books. Benedict, the way she's written him, he is a number 2. Like, you don't really know that much about him other than he has the Bridgerton's ability to flare up on a temper and be entitled. But I think that moment with Colin and Penelope, but also the way Penelope responds.
She's so strong and so brave, and my heart just broke all over the place for her.
Yeah. The fact that she says, I didn't ask you to marry me. But then she also asked Benedict if he'd be upset if she didn't want to marry, like if they didn't want to get married. And I was like, oh, you went point 1. Let me give you another point. And I mean, the thing is that scene, and the first time I read it too, that was really quite resonant for me then as well. Because we've all had that feeling of overhearing someone say something about ourselves, but also to have confirmation that like Penelope's in love with him.
I mean, the fact that we're seeing this moment where I guess kind of the 2 key people in that scene, we're not getting it from either of their perspectives. We're getting it from Benedict, who's suddenly realizing that he's actually an emotional dunce and he's only just clocked that Penelope loves his brother.
It's kind of an inciting factor for his own emotional growth from there. I mean, he thinks of Penelope all of a sudden as a person, and thus, oh my God, all women might be people. Potentially Sophie is a person. Maybe I should think about her feelings.
Yeah. What if even the woman I proclaim to love is actually a person?
Oh.
He really is a little bit of a nothing, isn't he? Which is a shame, because I really think that this could have been an incredibly interesting story, like really exploring those social dynamics, even exploring, I mean, the Bridgertons are always referred to as one of the most popular families in the ton, and thus one of the most powerful. And this is a romance that should never, ever happen, that realistically could never, ever happen. And to try and make it happen, to try and use that power and that influence to try and cross those social boundaries and make it work. I think there was a lot there that could have been explored. And I think we see a lot of that explored through Sophie. Like Sophie is the one who explains why becoming a mistress is a problem. And Sophie is the one who explains that, you know, being a housemaid means that she, you know, that she has to marry another servant, but also explains that her upbringing means that she's torn between the two worlds because she's not sure that she could be happy with a servant who hasn't had the same educational benefits as her and thus might not be able to provide, you know, conversation and stimulation and that sort of companionship that she might like. Like, I think from Sophie's point of view, we get an interesting view of who is still a reasonably privileged servant within the servant class. But starting to see sort of that upstairs, downstairs stuff that we just never ever see explored from Benedick's side. And also realistically not within the framework of the book either. The whole idea is we're going to bring Sophie up out of this class and put her into the fairy tale Regency world without ever really thinking about her class or what that means, or indeed any of the other people who also work for the Bridgertons.
And she never talks about those women that helped her get to the ball once she's out of that environment. They're still in that horrible environment with Araminta, with the ever-changing maids doing 3 jobs. But there were other women in that service of that house, and they actually did, like, what was the blowback on them? She thinks about the blowback on Posey, but the thing is, like, Benedict and Sophie don't really have any friends or people that they really talk to. Sophie, that's part of her story in that she's alone. But Benedict does seem a bit displaced even in his family.
Which kind of makes me think that Sophie's going to be doing a lot of emotional labour.
Like, the best bits for me is one when he asks her to be a mistress and he asks her why not. And she's like, because I don't want to. I was like, that's all you need to say. No. But secondly, like, all the stuff with her in the parlour with the Bridgerton ladies, I thought was really great. It showed her a bit more sassy and her intelligence, because she's talking about how she's smart for a long time. Are you? But we do see a bit of that, like, Hyacinth brattiness sort of brings out a lot of Sophie's snarkiness, and I quite like that. Yeah, I just think it's really interesting that we've got Anthony, who's determined never to be in love because of what happened to his dad. We've got Daphne, who really wanted to find someone but was apparently not that popular because she was friend-zoned all the time. Benedict doesn't really seem to think about any of that at all. He's non-reflective.
I've just found, like, a really good example of his lack of reflection. So it's very start of chapter 12. You want me to be your mistress, she said flatly. He gave her a confused look, although she couldn't be sure whether that was because her statement was so obvious or because he objected to her choice of words. I want you to be with me, he persisted. The moment was so staggeringly painful, and yet she found herself almost smiling. How is that different from being your mistress? Sophie. How is it different, she repeated, her voice growing strident. I don't know, Sophie. He sounded impatient. Does it matter? Yes, it fucking matters. How is it different? Articulate. What's the difference between I love you and I want to be with you, but I'm not marrying you, but we're gonna fuck, to I want you to be my mistress? Like, what is the actual difference?
Also, he does talk about how they're going to have all these babies together when she's his mistress. I'm like, that doesn't fall into line with Bridgerton, like, the way the Bridgertons work either. Like, it's like, your mother would be so disappointed in you right now. Violet will go into strategic warfare to make sure that your love will get a fake story and risen somewhat through the ranks so you can retire to the country. But if she had illegitimate grandchildren that you deliberately decided to have illegitimately, like, she would love them, but it would be a major problem. Like, she can't really do anything about that. She can't invent, like, a Penwood relative like she did for Sophie. It doesn't really it doesn't feel like he doesn't feel like he fits in the family. And I guess that's kind of and he keeps talking about how he wished he was considered a little less a Bridgerton and a bit more himself. But if you take away the Bridgerton, what is there?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. We don't really ever get to know who Benedict is, apart from being clueless and selfish and occasionally very mean, and also a Bridgerton. Like he's never really developed as a character. No. His development happens between I'm gonna fuck you as my mistress to I'm gonna fuck you as my wife.
No wonder I'm disappointed in him.
So can I ask, it's meant to be a romance. He spends a lot of time, correct me if I am wrong in saying this, and she is like reasonably aware of the fact that he spends a good deal of the book sort of not fully committing to like letting himself fall in love with Sophie, because he is in love with someone who we know is Sophie, but he met at a ball a few years ago, like, and spent, I don't know, half an evening together. And this is enough for him to emotionally hold back. Is that romantic?
I mean, the idea behind it, the masked woman at the masquerade, and as you said, his weird spidey sense that only comes into play when she's around. You turning around and just knowing. Like that, I think that's a really classic romance trope. That's where almost all the fated mates came from, right? This idea that when you see the person you're meant to be with, there's something like some fundamental shift in you that says, yes, you're the one.
That made my teenies really unfun, mind you. I kept waiting for that sense to kick in. It didn't really.
Yeah, no, it never has for me either. And I got married without it, so... I mean, maybe I made an enormous mistake.
Kate, one day you're going to be at a ball, at a masquerade, and you're going to have this feeling, this innate feeling. You're going to turn around and see someone.
And then I'm going to get my divorce lawyer on the phone.
Exactly.
It just occurred to me, like, Sophie can read, she knows Latin, she knows French, she knows all this stuff, but they never taught her to freaking dance.
Yeah, that was weird, I thought.
More than dancing.
I don't know, maybe that was something that Araminta could deny her.
I was going to say, would that maybe have to do with the age she was when her father died? Because, like, at a certain point, once you can read, you can get better on your own. Whereas, like, if she's not being taught to dance...
And it was useful for the story because then Benedict had a reason to, like, hold on to her in private, right?
There's the third Spidey sense tingling moment when he's naked. And the whole time that scene's happening, I can think I've just been watching the ITV British series Sanditon, which is an adaptation of Jane Austen's unfinished work. And they have a scene just like that. And I preferred it.
Maybe there's a reason why our spidey senses haven't kicked in yet. Maybe we have to be naked in order for it to happen.
Naked and Theo James. Yeah.
All right. Is there anything we actually liked about this book? Are there any redeeming factors to it? I mean, for me, it was more getting to see more of the Bridgertons. I really liked getting to see like the informal teas with Lady Bridgerton and her daughters. I really liked the scene in the jail with Lady Bridgerton basically scrubbing Sophie clean, taking care of Araminta, and getting her second son married off, which we know is incredibly important to her, all in like the space of 5 minutes. She was terrifyingly efficient in that scene.
Oh, that seems brilliant. I mean, she really is the MVP. Like, like he's not wrong when he says like you're the best of mothers. Like she really is. Like, there is that moment she's talking about her husband with Benedict, and it does occur to me that none of her children actually talk to her about their dad ever, unless it's their story. Just they haven't talked about it for 10 years. That she says this line, "I always wish your father were here, always." And I was like, it's sad that she's not getting any, but like, and that, you know, she's a woman who was in love and now she can't love again, and that she's sort of been resigned to being mother. But it's, you know, the way it's still nice as well that she's so loyal to him still, and that loyalty comes out in those brilliant moments, like in the jail. Like, you know, she's really had to step up without her husband there. And they were like apparently a really strong team. So she's really had to go hard. And I really liked that. I love her machinations. And there's no Lady Danbury in this one.
Doesn't Lady Danbury stop Benedict? And that's why Sophie manages to get away in that first scene.
So I really would have loved for her to rap him over the head with her cane. Like, I think he kind of needed it.
Yeah.
Maybe that is one of the problems that I have with this book. Lady Danbury is not there pulling him into gear. It really does suffer from a lack of.
Sophie like a pulling up moment. But I think Violet is really quite a strong presence in this book, well, at least the second half. I think she's kind of fulfilling some of the advice that Danbury would usually give, but in a softer, more maternal way.
It definitely have that sort of older mentor, older woman character in Lady Bridgerton this time around instead of Lady Danbury.
Kate asked what are the things that we liked about this book, and it's taken me this long to think of anything. We're clearly drawing closer to like who is Lady Whistledown. There's a few like clues that are dropped, and we do end on a scene with her, which like we did in the last book too, The Viscount Who Loved Me. Like we get sort of the final scene in An Offer from a Gentleman that it's Lady Whistledown kind of deciding time for something new, time to finally be me. We are clearly really close to learning who she is, and I'm excited because the Lady Whistledown mystery is like one of my faves through like as like a thread throughout the early books. I love it.
I thought of something I did like, but it also is Quinn crapping on people that are overweight or unattractive or silly.
Go on.
That Philippa dressed up as an orange, Prudence as an apple, and Mrs. Featherington as a bunch of grapes to the it's so ridiculous.
I have a pronunciation question because I've always said it whistled down in my head. Now I'm worried that I've been saying it wrong the whole time.
My South Australian might have been coming out.
Well, I mean, Rudy said Whistledown too.
Okay.
So it just might be my Canadian wants to really lean into the down.
Yeah. I did like that there was the discussion about that it could be a Bridgerton because that Lady Whistledown is quite nice to the Bridgertons. Like they're always discussed, but it's never that harsh. And that people are clearly speculating it could be them. But I liked that Benedict said, like, we're not smart enough to be that, but we would be able to work it out straight away if it was someone in the family. It's like, that's probably true.
All right. So An Offer from a Gentleman, not one of the more successful books in the series so far.
Our What the Featherington moment. Does anybody have something as a What the Featherington?
I think my What the Featherington moment, I think Adela's going to speak to Benedict's behavior towards Araminta in the jail. But for me, it was the way that he treated Sophie after they slept together, where he was like, I'm going to send someone to go get your clothes. And she's like, no, don't think you are. Think we're going to continue on. And he was like, what? I don't understand. We totally just slept together, and thus you are going to fall in line with my plans because clearly I have a magic penis that you cannot get enough of now. And Sophie's like, pretty magic, had a good time, gonna think about it a lot, but still not gonna be a mistress. You know, his dicking wasn't good enough to overcome all of her objections to the thing.
He's Benedicking.
His Benedicting wasn't good enough to overcome all of her objections.
He talks about throwing a cushion on the blood spot on the couch like maybe someone will clean it up. But I'm like, you've got 2 spots now. I can guarantee it. One on the cushion, one on the couch.
Oh no, it's not that someone will clean it up. It's that maybe no one will notice if I just cover it with a cushion.
God, it's such a boy thing, isn't it?
It's like, I just keep thinking about like what that couch looks like, and that there's this random pillow like cushion that is just like, it's kind of haphazardly thrown there, and it the very first time that a servant comes in to clean his room, it's gonna be moved to like a more aesthetic like spot.
Oh, I think what the Featherington, as Kate alluded to, moment would be Benedict grabbing Araminta by the throat in the jail cell.
I mean, it did stop her from talking.
I mean, yeah, but still,
Probably not okay.
Benedicts, the Bridgertons really do have a hair trigger like violence streak.
Well, I mean, Sophie leaves too. She ends up giving Araminta a black eye, like 2 seconds later.
Yeah.
They're not above a little argy-bargy, our Bridgertons.
Mm-hmm. Apparently, the publishers wanted to call it Sophie's Chase. How insane is that?
That's so bad. Why? No, so bad.
I read that on the Julia Quinn's website.
That's so bad. Hey, I was on Julia Quinn's website a little bit earlier today, and she provides song lists, like soundtracks for each of the books.
Yes, she does.
Want to know what's on?
Yes, please.
Offer from a Gentleman. Whenever, Wherever by Shakira.
I just keep thinking of like, lucky that my breasts are small and humble so you don't confuse them with mountains. Yes.
Well, yeah. Oh, well.
Okay. It's time now for
What Would Danbury Do?
This is where we imagine that a character from another favourite book has written to Terror of the Ton, Lady Danbury, to ask for advice.
Which is great because, as we mentioned, Lady Danbury does not get a look in this book at all. So I feel like it's important that we acknowledge her superiority in our podcast. So this letter comes from Cherry in Talia Hibbert's The Princess Trap. Dear Lady Danbury, so I've met this man and he is off the charts hot and our chemistry is unbelievable. But before our first kiss can turn into anything more, I find out that he's been lying about who he is and now he's offered me an eye-watering sum of money to pretend to be his fiancée for a year. I'm pretty sure I can't trust him, but I really need this money. And I can't ignore how he makes me feel. And did I mention he's a prince? Help?
Well, initially I thought Lady Danbury would offer one of her footmen to kneecap him. The hero of that book. But I don't know. I'd like to think Danbury wouldn't be swayed by the prince component because she's pretty wise and wily. But I mean,
fake relationships are not an unknown thing in the ton. They're not even an unknown thing in this series. I mean, that's what the Duke and I was about.
I think that Lady Danbury would recommend that Cherry go in with her eyes open, but yeah, get that money, girl.
And don't trust him. Like, get the money, don't trust him, hold yourself.
Yeah, like, be careful, keep your eye on things, but you can do a lot with an eye-watering sum of money. Like, that sounds like it's the kind of money that sets you up for life. And also, I've read that book. I fucking love that book. And
it's so good.
And like, because she works as an administrative assistant in a private school, but like she actually has like ethics and values. Yeah, that's some shade. What of it?
I played mostly with the Cinderella trope, but I thought that The Princess Trap did it really well. Both of the characters went into the Cinderella relationship with their own, I suppose, with their own needs and their own wants and what they each expected. So all of the expectations were incredibly clear from the get-go, going into this fake relationship. And the Cinderella aspect comes in, of course, because he's a prince and she is very much not a princess. But I really liked the way that the power dynamics played out in the course of the story. Like, he might be a prince and, you know, so rich and have so much social cachet in that regard, but she is giving him something that he really can't get by himself, which is respectability, which is stability, which is somebody who sees him for who he is and not for what his position is. Also, it's really hot. The book is really hot. I just really, really enjoyed reading it. And I thought the conclusion was really, really nice.
One of my favorite things about it, and the way that I recommend it to a lot of people, is that, like, on their first date, she obviously wants to get cake, and so he gets cake for her, and it just makes me so happy. He seduces her with cake.
As we all should be.
As
exactly.
is right and good in the world. That's all for this episode of What Would Danbury Do? We'll be back in a fortnight with Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. In the meantime, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram as @BridgertonPod, or send us an email at @BridgertonPod@gmail.com. This episode was recorded on the traditional and unceded land of the Gadigal, Wurundjeri and Bunurong people, and edited by me, audio producer Rudy Bremer, on Gadigal country. Thanks for listening, and remember, WWDD.